welcome back. My name is Omar, and I attend the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. In my English 105 class this semester, me and my fellow classmates were tasked to do an informal experiment on mindfulness. We had experts in the field like Dr. Paula Huffman and Dr. Susan Gaylord come into the classroom and introduce us to these concepts. In class, these experts guided us through three formal practices: a body scan, walking meditation, and seated meditation. We're also given some health benefits that could be expected if these practices were incorporated into our routine. Some were reduced stress levels, a calmer state of being, and increased productivity. To test this, I practiced mindfulness every day for 10 minutes a day over a span of a week to see if I could change my overall state of being and reduce my stress levels. Started off with a baseline day, and for each day that followed, recorded the mindfulness activity I chose, how I felt before the experiment started, how I felt after each activity, and how my state of being was after a certain amount of days relative to the baseline day. In my experiment, I practiced all three formal mindfulness activities mentioned at least once. Jumping right into the experiment, on my baseline day, I remember feeling anxious and unmotivated, and I recall setting a goal of balance and control of my state of being. The baseline was around the time I had a big midterm that happens to precede a final exam, so I wanted to stay on top of my work and get a good grade. This and my current job is some of my many stressors that I face being a college student. Going into the experiment, I viewed practicing mindfulness as a tedious and unpleasing activity that would require me to pause my normal day. As the experiment went on, this quickly changed. On the first 2 days, I picked walking meditation because it was the easiest to fit into my schedule. I remember the teachings of our guest speaker, Dr. Paula Huffman, and focused my attention on my feet going to the bus stop and coming back to my apartment from the bus stop. In both of these practices, I remember it was very hard to focus on my feet and tune out my surroundings because I live in a relatively high noise pollution area. After each of the following days, I didn't feel any difference in my state of being. I just remember feeling like it was a temporary distraction from the real work I have to do when I got back to my apartment or when I get to school. On day 3, however, I was in the library and I changed my activity to a body scan. After this session, I felt more motivated to finish my work, so I kept a note that it helped my short-term productivity. To not completely abandon the walking meditation, I came back to it on day 4, but this time I went to a trail where I knew it would be quiet and easier to tune out my surroundings. After the mindfulness activity, I gained a keen sense of appreciation for my surroundings and was less anxious about my project. On day 5 and day 6, I reverted back to the body scan as I found earlier. When incorporated into my study routine, it made for a more productive session. But this time, I had a longer study period, so I decided to incorporate 2 body scans instead of 1. I recall after these 2 body scans that I was more in tune with my emotions, but my productivity remained the same. Finally, on the last day, to get a full grasp on all activities, I tried the seated meditation at my desk. Prior to it, I arranged the environment by lighting some candles, taking a shower, and shutting all my blinds. Going into the activity, I was already relaxed, but after listening to a guided seated meditation, I felt the weight of my tensions being lifted off my shoulders, and it became my favorite activity because it temporarily changed my state of being compared to the other 2 activities, even though I only practiced it once. There is still one question that has yet to be answered. Were there any long-term effects? Personally, I don't think there actually were. However, there were short-term effects like increased productivity and fleeting anxiousness. I felt like this experiment was conclusive because although it temporarily changed my state of being after each session, these effects were quickly fleeting. Comparatively to my baseline, my mind was less cluttered and more organized, but this could just be a placebo effect because I don't remember how much of a difference it made due to not remembering how stressful of a day that was. I did have some mentionable observations during the experiment. I noticed that changing my surroundings made for a better outcome. For example, when practicing walking meditation, I used my time going to and coming from the bus stop at the time to practice mindfulness, but when I changed it to a quiet trail, coupled with the help of an audio guide, it was easier to focus on my feet. I didn't have any transitions in my state of being, so after the first 2 days, I switched to the body scan, in which I noticed the relationship between the effectiveness of practice and how calm I made my surroundings. It is important to go into the practice with an open mind and peaceful surroundings to increase the effectiveness of the practice. It was also worth noting that the more I did a particular practice, the better I was able to focus. Like, for example, in my last body scan, it was easier to feel the sensations mentioned in my audio guide because I was more in tune with my surroundings. To capture the full experience of my last day, I practiced seated meditation. And to my surprise, this became my favorite one because it subconsciously incorporated little itty bits of details from each of the previous practices. While practicing body scans and seated meditation, I noticed that studying that I did after was more concentrated and my mind was less cluttered. I also experimented with practicing mindfulness more than once a day for one day, but I didn't notice any significant changes from the previous days. I think over time I got better at being mindful, and this contributed to my last being my favorite. Noticed that although I went into it with a common mindset, referring to my last day, there was a noticeable improvement in my state of being and my happiness after my last practice. Now for the long-awaited conclusion. I would like to say that my practicing mindfulness did have some short-term benefits like productivity and a clearer mindset, but in my own personal experience, I can't say I noticed any long-term effects like a change in my state of being compared to the baseline day. However, it is important to note that this experiment was done over a course of a week, and it may take longer than that to see long-term effects. Another limiting factor is that the time span and what time of day you do the practice. It may be that practicing mindfulness right out of bed or before sleep for a span of 20 minutes rather than 10 minutes might give more conclusive results. Not to mention, I practice all these mindfulness activities rather than sticking to just one, which makes it difficult to justify the results. I'm sure now that to seek noticeable improvements, I would have to go into the experiment with a clearer head and fewer distractions around me. Additionally, I think dedicating time to practicing mindfulness is a good escape from reality. Many people have busy schedules, and because of this, we're all human and we are always pressing on that gas pedal of what to do next and what needs to be done. In contrast, mindfulness teaches you to enjoy the moment rather than stress the future. Comparing my long-term effects to the ones noticed to the ones advertised by the likes of Dr. Paul Hoffman, Dr. Susan Gaylord, and Jon Kabat-Zinn, I can say that mindfulness did have a long-term effect on me personally. However, this can be changed from person to person. The lack of long-term effects can be attributed to many things. For example, I think simply the time span of a week practicing mindfulness was just too short to observe any effects. I do believe long-term effects can be noticeable for other individuals, but it is limited by how much these individuals believe it will work. You have to believe it will work and try to accommodate yourself against the distractions you might have. Kind of like you get what you put into it type of deal. I believe it is something that should be tried by everyone and anyone. And if I had to refer mindfulness practice to someone, I would change a couple things. I would suggest that an experiment is over a longer period of time because assessing something over a week just does not do it justice. Then I would stick to one practice like a seated meditation over the duration of the experiment. Additionally, I would pick a certain time of day, like right after waking up, as a dedicated time to practice. Also, it is worth mentioning again that the mindset going into the activity is everything. If you believe in it, I think you get more out of it. So future questions that have spawned from this experiment is the actual benefits of productivity coming from mindfulness, which was the biggest thing that I noticed in my experiment. Being a college student, I would want to know, can practicing mindfulness before a long, hard study session make your time more efficient? And if it is possible to compare these results to not practicing mindfulness and just studying for long periods of time. I had a fun time doing this experiment, and I would suggest others try it as well, using the suggestions that I mentioned earlier. I learned something new, and my thoughts on mindfulness as a whole have completely changed. Thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoyed this journey with me half as much as I enjoyed being on it.